There's something about avoidant people that almost nobody explains properly, and it's this. Your absence ends up echoing louder in their head than your presence ever did while you were still around. At first glance, that sounds completely backwards. After all, these are people who often seem relieved when they finally get space. They pull away during moments of emotional closeness. They become quieter precisely when the relationship begins feeling deeper. To anyone experiencing this, it can feel confusing, even painful. You begin wondering whether they ever cared at all. You question every memory, every conversation, every affectionate moment, because their withdrawal seems to erase the emotional reality you believed you shared. But what many people fail to understand is that avoidant attachment is rarely about an absence of emotion. More often, it is about an inability to comfortably stay connected to emotion while it is actively happening. That distinction changes everything. An avoidant person's nervous system frequently interprets emotional intimacy very differently from someone with secure attachment. Where another person experiences closeness as comfort, safety, and belonging, an avoidant individual may unconsciously experience the exact same closeness as pressure, expectation, or a subtle loss of freedom. This response is not usually deliberate. It is an automatic protective strategy that often develops over many years, sometimes beginning in childhood when emotional needs were ignored, criticized, or inconsistently met. Over time, their mind learns an important lesson. Dependence feels dangerous. Needing people feels risky. The safest position becomes emotional self-reliance. This lesson is rarely taught through words. No one usually sits a child down and says, "Never rely on anyone." Instead, the lesson is absorbed through repeated emotional experiences. A child reaches for comfort and finds criticism. They express sadness and are told they are being too sensitive. They ask for reassurance but are met with indifference, inconsistency, or emotional unavailability. Little by little, the child's nervous system begins drawing conclusions about how the world works. It concludes that vulnerability is expensive. It concludes that expressing needs often leads to disappointment. It concludes that relying on someone else creates the possibility of being hurt. The child's developing brain is incredibly adaptive. Its primary goal is survival, not emotional fulfillment. So rather than continuing to seek comfort from people who cannot consistently provide it, the mind quietly changes its strategy. It begins convincing itself that emotional independence is not simply preferable, but necessary. Instead of thinking, "I need someone," the mind slowly learns to think, "I only have myself." At first, this adaptation is remarkably effective. If you stop expecting comfort, disappointment hurts less. If you stop asking for help, rejection becomes less frequent. If you convince yourself you don't need affection, you never have to experience the fear of losing it. From the perspective of a child's survival, this strategy makes perfect sense. The problem is that the strategy doesn't disappear when childhood ends. It quietly follows them into adulthood. Years later, they enter romantic relationships carrying the exact same protective blueprint that once helped them survive emotionally. Only now, that blueprint begins creating problems where it once created safety. Imagine trying to build a beautiful home using emergency shelter instructions. The instructions kept you alive during a storm, but they were never meant to become permanent architecture. Yet, that is often what avoidant attachment feels like. Their emotional defenses were designed for protection. Instead, they become permanent walls. As adults, avoidant individuals often pride themselves on being independent. They may genuinely enjoy solving their own problems. They dislike feeling indebted to others. Asking for help can feel strangely uncomfortable, even when people are eager to support them. They often tell themselves they simply prefer handling everything alone. Sometimes this independence looks admirable. They appear calm during crises. They rarely burden others with their struggles. They seem emotionally composed. They present themselves as highly self-sufficient. Many people even admire these qualities. But beneath that independence, another story is often unfolding. Because emotional self-reliance is not always the same thing as emotional freedom. Sometimes it is emotional isolation, wearing confidence as a disguise. The avoidant person may genuinely believe they are strongest when standing completely alone, yet that belief often comes at a significant emotional cost. When life becomes difficult, they don't instinctively reach toward people. They instinctively withdraw. When stress increases, they create distance. When emotions become overwhelming, they distract themselves rather than sharing them. When relationships deepen, they begin searching for reasons to regain space, not because they don't care, because depending on another human being activates an old fear they may not even recognize consciously. Deep inside, dependence has become associated with vulnerability, and vulnerability has become associated with danger. This creates one of the greatest paradoxes of avoidant attachment. They often long for connection while simultaneously fearing everything genuine connection requires. Everyone wants to be understood. Everyone wants acceptance. Everyone wants someone who feels emotionally safe. Avoidant individuals are no different. The difference lies in what happens once they actually begin receiving those things. As intimacy grows, another part of their nervous system begins asking uncomfortable questions. What if I become too attached? What if they disappoint me? What if I lose myself? What if they eventually leave? What if I need them more than they need me? These questions rarely arrive as clear, conscious thoughts. Instead, they appear as emotional discomfort. They feel restless, overwhelmed, irritated without understanding why. They suddenly crave more personal space. They convince themselves something about the relationship feels wrong. Sometimes they mistake emotional vulnerability for incompatibility. The relationship itself may not be the problem. The closeness simply activates unresolved fears. To someone with secure attachment, emotional dependence often feels natural. Healthy dependence is understood as mutual support, two people choosing each other while maintaining their individuality. For an avoidant person, however, dependence can feel dangerously close to surrendering control. Control becomes safety. Distance becomes safety. Independence becomes safety. And because these beliefs have been reinforced for years, they begin shaping countless small decisions. They hesitate before asking for emotional reassurance. They avoid difficult conversations. They minimize their own feelings. They convince themselves they are fine when they clearly are not. They tell themselves they don't care nearly as much as they actually do. Sometimes they genuinely believe these stories. The mind becomes incredibly skilled at protecting itself from emotional awareness. Psychologists often describe this as deactivation. Instead of fully experiencing painful emotions, the mind unconsciously reduces awareness of them. It highlights flaws in the partner. It focuses on personal freedom. It emphasizes independence. It convinces itself that being alone would feel easier. These thoughts reduce emotional vulnerability in the short term, but they also reduce emotional intimacy. The result is a relationship that often feels confusing for both people involved. The avoidant partner may genuinely care deeply while behaving as though they care very little. Meanwhile, the other partner experiences increasing uncertainty. They begin trying harder, giving more, explaining more, reassuring more. Ironically, this often intensifies the avoidant person's discomfort, not because affection is unwanted, because receiving that affection creates an uncomfortable sense of obligation. They begin worrying that someone now expects emotional openness they don't know how to provide consistently. They fear disappointing the very person they care about. Instead of discussing these fears openly, they often retreat. Distance feels easier than vulnerability. Silence feels safer than emotional honesty. From the outside, this withdrawal appears cold. Inside, however, something much more complicated is happening. They are trying to regulate emotions they never learned how to manage in healthy ways. Many avoidant individuals secretly admire emotionally expressive people while simultaneously feeling overwhelmed by them. They appreciate warmth. They enjoy closeness. They crave understanding. Yet when those things become consistently available, their nervous system interprets them through old experiences rather than present reality. The past quietly colors the present. A loving partner becomes unconsciously associated with previous emotional disappointments. Current affection becomes filtered through earlier memories of inconsistency. The relationship is no longer being experienced exactly as it is being experienced through layers of emotional history. That is why healing avoidant attachment is not simply about finding the right partner. The healthiest relationship in the world cannot automatically erase deeply conditioned survival responses. Real healing begins when the avoidant individual becomes curious about their own patterns. When they stop asking, "Why do people become too much?" and begin asking, "Why does closeness make me uncomfortable? When did I learn that needing someone was dangerous? Who taught me that depending on others meant losing myself?" Those questions open doors that years of emotional suppression cannot. Slowly, they begin discovering that dependence and helplessness are not the same thing. Trust and weakness are not the same thing. Love and loss of freedom are not the same thing. Healthy relationships are not prisons. They are partnerships. Two independent people choosing connection not because they cannot survive alone, but because life becomes richer when shared. For many avoidant individuals, accepting that truth requires unlearning years, sometimes decades, of emotional conditioning. It requires discovering that strength is not measured by how little you need people. Real strength is measured by your ability to let trustworthy people matter without believing that doing so will destroy your independence. As adults, that lesson doesn't simply disappear. Instead, it quietly shapes how they experience every meaningful relationship. They can genuinely enjoy someone's company. They can admire them, laugh with them, care about them, and even love them deeply. Yet the closer the relationship becomes, the more their internal alarm system begins whispering that they are losing control. That internal conflict is exhausting. On one side, there is a natural human desire for love, companionship, and emotional connection. On the other side stands a deeply conditioned instinct, telling them that too much closeness eventually leads to disappointment, vulnerability, rejection, or emotional suffocation. Those two forces pull against one another almost constantly. This is why many avoidant people appear inconsistent. One week they seem incredibly affectionate. They initiate conversations, plan future experiences together, and show warmth that feels genuine. Then suddenly, without warning, they become distant. Messages become shorter, calls become less frequent, affection decreases, emotional conversations are postponed or avoided altogether. To the other person, it feels as though someone flipped a switch overnight, but inside the avoidant person's mind, the process usually feels much slower. They are gradually becoming emotionally overstimulated. Imagine carrying a backpack that becomes heavier every single day without realizing it. At first, the weight is manageable. Then, it becomes uncomfortable. Eventually, your only thought becomes putting the backpack down. That doesn't necessarily mean you dislike the journey or the person walking beside you. It simply means your nervous system has become overwhelmed. For avoidant individuals, emotional intimacy can create a similar experience. Every vulnerable conversation, every request for reassurance, every discussion about commitment, every expectation of emotional availability can slowly accumulate until their instinct tells them they need distance just to breathe again. That is why they often withdraw precisely when their partner wants greater closeness. It isn't always because love has disappeared. Sometimes it is because emotional intensity has exceeded what their coping mechanisms know how to handle. Ironically, while you are still present, they may never fully appreciate your value. Not because you lack value. This creates one of the greatest misunderstandings between avoidant and securely attached individuals. The secure partner often thinks, if I love them more, reassure them more, become more understanding, they'll finally feel safe. The avoidant partner often experiences the opposite. The more reassurance they receive, the more emotionally exposed they begin feeling. The more someone moves closer, the stronger their instinct becomes to create space. Neither person necessarily intends to hurt the other. They're simply responding to completely different emotional realities. Then comes the moment that changes everything. You stop chasing. The daily messages disappear. The good morning texts no longer arrive. The phone stops lighting up with your name. The conversations that once filled their evenings quietly vanish, and something unexpected happens. The emotional pressure they had been reacting to suddenly disappears. At first, many avoidant individuals genuinely experience relief. There is more silence, more independence, more room to think. The immediate anxiety surrounding emotional expectations fades. Their nervous system calms because the perceived demand for vulnerability has been removed. To an outside observer, it may look as though they've moved on effortlessly. But this first stage often tells only half the story. As days become weeks and weeks become months, something subtle begins unfolding beneath the surface. Without constant interaction, requiring immediate emotional responses, their mind finally has enough space to begin processing what actually happened. Memories begin appearing unexpectedly. A restaurant reminds them of a conversation they once enjoyed. A song suddenly brings back a road trip. A familiar perfume or cologne triggers emotions they never acknowledged before. They remember the way you encouraged them during difficult moments. They remember the small routines that quietly made life feel stable. They remember your patience, your kindness, your consistency. Things they barely noticed while you were still there suddenly become emotionally significant. Why? Because reflection is different from reaction. While the relationship existed, their brain remained focused on managing emotional activation. Once the relationship is gone, that activation decreases, allowing deeper emotional reflection to begin. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as delayed emotional processing. Instead of immediately grieving the loss, avoidant individuals often postpone grief without realizing it. Their coping strategy emphasizes emotional suppression, distraction, and self-sufficiency, but suppressed emotions rarely disappear. They simply wait. Eventually, they surface, sometimes quietly, sometimes all at once. That delayed realization catches many avoidant people completely off guard. They expected freedom. Instead, they discover emptiness. This doesn't mean every avoidant person secretly longs for every former partner. It doesn't mean every breakup ends with regret. People leave relationships for many valid reasons. Some relationships are unhealthy. Some are incompatible. Some genuinely need to end. Attachment style is only one influence among many. But when genuine love existed beneath avoidant defenses, absence often creates psychological clarity that constant closeness never could. Human beings naturally adapt to what is consistently available. We stop noticing the refrigerator humming. We stop noticing the ticking clock. We stop noticing how comfortable our favorite chair is until it breaks. The human brain normalizes constant experiences. Relationships work similarly. While someone consistently shows up, supports us, and cares for us, that presence gradually becomes part of everyday life. We begin expecting it without consciously appreciating it. Only when it disappears does the emotional landscape change. Suddenly, the silence feels unusually loud. The empty chair at dinner becomes noticeable. The missing message in the morning stands out. The person who quietly occupied countless ordinary moments becomes impossible to ignore precisely because they are no longer there. For avoidant individuals, this effect may become even stronger because emotional awareness was delayed throughout much of the relationship itself. Their feelings arrive after the noise has ended. That creates enormous internal conflict. Part of them misses the connection. Another part still fears intimacy. Part of them wants to reach out. Another part worries about becoming vulnerable again. Their attachment system pulls in opposite directions at the same time. One voice says, "You miss them." Another whispers, "Stay independent." One says, "Call." Another says, "You'll lose yourself." This internal battle explains why avoidant individuals sometimes check social media without sending a message, why they reread old conversations without responding, why they think about reconnecting but never actually press send. The struggle is not always about pride. Often, it is about fear. Fear disguised as distance. Fear disguised as independence. Fear disguised as certainty. Many avoidant individuals have spent years convincing themselves they don't need anyone. Yet beneath that protective identity often lives the same universal human longing for connection that exists in everyone else. The difference is not the absence of love. The difference is the difficulty of trusting love enough to remain emotionally present inside it. This is why your absence can echo louder than your presence ever did. While you were there, their defensive system was busy protecting them. After you leave, there is nothing left to defend against. Only memories remain. Memories ask quieter questions. Did they understand me better than I realized? Why did I feel safest telling them certain things? Why do ordinary places suddenly remind me of them? Why do I keep thinking about someone I insisted I needed distance from? Those questions often arrive long after everyone else assumes the story has already ended, but there is one final truth that deserves equal attention. Your goal should never become creating absence simply to trigger someone else's realization. Healthy relationships are not built on psychological strategies. They are built on mutual emotional availability. If someone only begins recognizing your worth after losing you, that realization belongs to their personal journey, not your responsibility. You cannot heal another person's attachment wounds by sacrificing your own peace. You cannot convince someone to become emotionally available through endless patience alone. Real change only happens when they become willing to examine their own patterns, acknowledge their fears, and learn healthier ways of connecting. Until then, your life deserves to keep moving forward. Because the most powerful form of absence is not one created to manipulate. It is the quiet absence that naturally follows self-respect. The absence created when you stop begging to be chosen. The absence created when you stop proving your worth to someone who cannot consistently receive it. The absence created when you redirect your energy toward building a life that feels meaningful, regardless of who stays or leaves. Ironically, that is often when avoidant individuals finally hear the echo, not because silence itself possesses magic, but because for the first time, there is enough quiet inside their own mind to recognize the value of what was once standing right in front of them. One of the defining characteristics of avoidant attachment is that emotional processing is frequently delayed. Instead of fully experiencing difficult feelings in the moment, avoidant individuals often suppress them. Their minds prioritize emotional self-protection over emotional awareness. When relationships become intense, their nervous system interprets closeness as pressure rather than comfort. So instead of leaning into the relationship, they instinctively create distance to reduce that internal discomfort. While you're still present, your emotional needs, conversations, and expectations can unintentionally activate their defensive system. Every request for reassurance, every discussion about commitment, every vulnerable conversation may feel like another demand on emotional resources they struggle to access. Even when they genuinely care about someone, that care can become tangled with anxiety about losing autonomy or being emotionally overwhelmed. Their focus shifts from appreciating the relationship to managing the discomfort that intimacy brings. That is why your presence can sometimes become psychologically difficult for them to fully experience. They're not necessarily ignoring your value. They're trying to regulate emotions they don't completely understand themselves. Their mind becomes occupied with escaping emotional pressure rather than recognizing emotional security. Then something changes. When you stop reaching out, when the messages stop, when the familiar routines disappear, when your attention quietly leaves, the external pressure vanishes. Ironically, the very distance they believed they needed often removes the defensive barrier that had been blocking their emotional awareness. Without constant interaction demanding immediate responses, their nervous system begins to settle. The emotional noise quiets down. And in that silence, memories that were previously buried start rising to the surface. This is why many avoidant individuals begin thinking about someone long after the relationship has ended. The mind finally has enough psychological space to process experiences that it postponed during the relationship itself. Conversations replay unexpectedly. Small acts of kindness suddenly carry more emotional weight. Familiar places trigger memories they never anticipated. Songs, routines, even ordinary moments begin connecting back to the person who is no longer there. Absence creates something presence never could: perspective. Psychologists sometimes describe this as delayed emotional processing. Instead of feeling grief immediately, avoidant individuals may experience it weeks, months, or even years later. During the relationship, emotional defenses remain active. After separation, those defenses gradually lose the immediate threat that kept them engaged. Feelings that were once pushed aside begin surfacing, often catching the avoidant person completely off guard. This doesn't mean every avoidant will return. It doesn't mean every silence is secretly filled with longing. People are individuals, not formulas. Some avoidant people continue moving forward without seeking reconnection. Others process the loss privately, but never act on it. Attachment style influences behavior, but it never guarantees specific outcomes. What often does happen, however, is that absence transforms your role in their internal world. While you were present, they were reacting to the relationship. After you're gone, they begin reflecting on it. Reflection is psychologically very different from reaction. Reaction happens in the middle of emotional activation. Reflection happens after the nervous system calms down. And reflection frequently allows emotions that were inaccessible before to become visible. Suddenly, they remember how consistently you supported them. They notice the emotional stability you quietly brought into their life. They realize how many routines included you without them consciously appreciating it. The things that once felt ordinary become irreplaceable precisely because they're no longer available. The human mind often notices missing pieces more vividly than existing ones. Think about how people rarely notice the constant hum of electricity until the power goes out. The silence itself becomes impossible to ignore. Relationships can operate in a surprisingly similar way. While someone is consistently present, the brain adapts to their presence as normal. Once that presence disappears, the emotional landscape changes, and the absence becomes impossible to overlook. For avoidant individuals, this effect can feel especially intense because so much emotional processing was postponed. What wasn't fully acknowledged during connection may emerge only after separation. This delayed realization can create significant internal conflict. Part of them misses the relationship. Another part still fears vulnerability. One side wants connection. The other side remembers why closeness once felt overwhelming. These opposing forces can leave avoidant individuals stuck between longing and self-protection. They may revisit old messages without replying. They may wonder how you're doing without reaching out. They may imagine conversations that never happen. Their internal world becomes filled with unfinished emotional business. From the outside, it can look like indifference. Inside, it may feel like unresolved grief. That hidden conflict explains why some avoidant individuals seem emotionally unaffected immediately after a breakup, only to struggle much later. Their emotional timeline often runs on a different schedule than people with more secure attachment patterns. What others process in days, they may process over months. But here's the important truth that often gets overlooked. Your absence becomes meaningful, not because you disappeared to teach them a lesson. It becomes meaningful because distance removes the emotional pressure that once prevented them from fully recognizing what the relationship meant. The realization is a consequence of their internal attachment dynamics, not a reward for playing games or using silence as a strategy. That distinction matters. Trying to manufacture absence in hopes of triggering someone's regret rarely creates healthy love. Genuine healing comes from respecting boundaries, valuing your own emotional well-being, and recognizing that another person's delayed awareness is not something you can control. If an avoidant person eventually realizes your value, that realization belongs to their own emotional journey. It cannot be forced, negotiated, or accelerated. Sometimes they return with greater self-awareness. Sometimes they simply carry the lesson into future relationships. Either way, your life should not remain paused while waiting for someone else's emotional clock to catch up. Because the deepest irony is this: the moment your absence begins echoing inside their mind is often the same moment you've finally stopped chasing, stopped convincing, and started building a life that no longer depends on whether they ever fully understand what they lost. In that sense, your absence becomes powerful, not because it changes them, but because it reflects the quiet strength of someone who chose self-respect over endless pursuit.